Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you and this morning presenting this prestige panel. In a moment, I'll be introducing you to my prestige speakers, but just in case you don't know them already, because I'm sure most of you know who these great museum directors are. But first, I thought I would start the talk by kind of framing the debate and ask what you'll probably think is a stupid question, especially since here we're at the 9th edition of the Art for Tomorrow conference. 9 years of this, and next year will be 10. And so in this context, it really will appear to you to be a rather silly query. And the question is, what is a museum? Everyone in this room is rolling their eyeballs at me right now and thinking, hasn't this woman had her morning coffee? What kind of a dumb question to ask is that? A museum, you think to yourself, that's where I go see the Mona Lisa. That's where I go look at Tyrannosaurus Rex with my children or myself. That's where I go to gaze in wonder at the Starry Night by Van Gogh, who is from the country of Pijbes, the Netherlands. It's a place where precious objects and treasures of national and international heritage are kept and preserved for all time. And of course, you would not be wrong. And yet, the definition of the museum was the focus of a very nasty spat in 2019. The International Council of Museums, or ICOM, which represents 119 countries, they actually had to postpone a vote on the definition of the museum because there were so many squabbles over it. The proposed new definition, which I'm about to read an excerpt to you of, was considered far too political, and even, you might say, in the modern day parlance, too woke. So that definition described museums as democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures. Somehow that was scary. And it was the aim of the museum was to contribute to, quote, human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Well, those seem pretty innocuous words to you, but they started a huge fight which lasted all the way through COVID, and it took 3 years for ICOM to actually agree on a definition of the museum. And that definition, which is the current one you can find on their website, is a museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible, inclusive, museums foster diversity and sustainability. As you can see, it's a somewhat watered down, somewhat more diplomatic definition. Who knew museums were such a contentious topic? And yet, if you think about it, museums are mirrors of the societies we live in. They are mirrors of us. Their collections, many of which were formed in colonial times, are coming under great scrutiny, and there are claims for their restitution from countries of origin and from indigenous communities. In the aftermath of the #MeToo and Black Lives Matter movements, there have been increasing demands for equality of gender and equality of representation. And if I can just introduce a very small, shameless plug, I've written a book about this. It's called Takedown, and you can find it online if you'd like. Okay, so basically, I'm about to get to you. Museums can no longer afford to be dusty and fusty temples of inertia. They need to move with the times. On my panel today, I have 3 speakers who have great experience managing major museums. And each of them, however, you will find, has a slightly different definition of the role of the museum. I don't expect my guests to be squabbling in this debate. I don't think that they're going to be at each other's throats. We're not going to have like an ICOM situation, but there are differences, I think you'll find. Mariët, I'd like to start with you. You literally just started your job as the director and CEO of the Solomon Guggenheim Museum and Foundation. So you're in charge of 3 museums right now: Guggenheim in New York, the Guggenheim right here in Venice, Guggenheim Bilbao, and then soon you will be in charge of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi when it opens. The Guggenheim's remit, you told me, since 1937, has been to collect, preserve, research, and display modern and contemporary art in your various museums. But I wanted to ask you, Mariët, from your standpoint, museums like the Guggenheim, you've told me, are not political organizations, and they don't make partisan statements. But in these very political times we live in these very activist times we live in, how can your museum stay true to its remit and stay relevant?
Thank you very much, Farah, for framing this conversation so well. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to be in the Palazzo Gedo for this wonderful Art for Tomorrow conference. So it's a great thing to be able to say on day 4 of my new job that the Solomon or Guggenheim Museum was never a fusty and dusty old museum, because the very first purpose-built building that the foundation oversaw is, of course, our magnificent Frank Lloyd Wright building on Fifth Avenue. And Hilary Bay and Solomon R. Guggenheim charged Frank Lloyd Wright, they gave him the brief, built us a temple of the spirit and a museum for tomorrow. And I think that is really in our DNA, and therefore I represent maybe a particular kind of museum on this panel. Our museum, and its relevance, as you asked me, its relevance devolves directly from its mission. And here I will say, when I go into that for a second, that I think it's very important not to mistake relevance for politics. Of course, politics has a massive role in the world, in media, in all of our institutions and in our lives, but there are many ways of being relevant without being a political platform, and I think that's often forgotten. So the Guggenheim museums in our beautiful constellation, which, as you just described it, is resolutely international, extending from New York into Europe and soon into West Asia and the Arab world, I think you have to think of its relevance as directly attendant on that international character. Nowhere better to think about it than here in Venice, of course, at the Biennale, which has become such an extraordinarily crossroads-oriented manifestation of art, especially this year in Adriano Pedrosa's conception. But what is our mission, and why is it relevant? The mission of the Guggenheim museums is to collect, display, and support the art of today. That was always our mission back in 1937, and it continues to be today. Of course, the art of today becomes the art of yesterday before too long, but you need to collect it so that you can tell stories about it, draw different stories out of it in the future. And so when we give artists the opportunity to show art in any of our museums, we do that because we believe in freedom of expression, creative expression, without interference from us. But of course we do curate. We're not here to propel hate speech, for example. So there's careful curation involved. But we do not, by showing particular art, either endorse that art, that the viewpoint that that artist may hold in some other part of their universe, or that the art itself may draw out in people's interpretations. We are here to support freedom of expression and dialogue around it, teaching around it, community engagement around it, and the relevance evolves from the fact that artists bring a very particular and interesting views on the world around us into our lives, into our midst, and that's what our museums exist to support.
Yes, but by collecting the art of today, right? You say you don't want to be political, and that's fine. And Sandra was nodding at that point. I'm not sure why. Maybe Sandra can tell us.
We're old friends.
Maybe, okay. But by collecting the art of today, right? The art of today is the art of John Akomfrah, who's about to come on stage. He's my next speaker. Mm-hmm. The art of John Akomfora, I'm just taking one example, is very political. So through the choice of art that you collect, you are, in a way, making some kind of political choice, some kind of statement, you are reflecting.
We are reflecting, we are curating, we are bringing forth art that we think is interesting for people to engage with and deal with. Some issues, you could say, you've mentioned some of them. Climate change, for example, is a major issue. And you could say that it's political, but for most people on Earth, it's a reality that we have to deal with. So this is one thing that John's work brings out so beautifully. I want to give one example where you are right. Things can be taken politically, even if they weren't intended to be. Take Wassily Kandinsky. Wassily Kandinsky, of course, one of the founding artists, in a way, of the Guggenheim. The Kandinskys in our collections are just extraordinary and beloved. And if you're a lover of painting, as I am, and of European painting and its history, it's so important to keep looking at them. Well, Kandinsky also had very strong views on what motivated his art. And he wrote, and most of you have read it if you're an art historian, On the Spiritual in Art, which the Guggenheim Museum and Foundation ended up translating and publishing. The text from 1911, we republished it as a translation in 1946. Kandinsky has many things to say about the colors white and black and their distinction. And I could read those words to you right now, and if you heard them, you might think, wow, is that really what we want to say about white and black? How would that register today? And interestingly, in the Spanish pavilion, in the Biennale, Sandra Gamarra Heshiki, the artist who installed the Spanish pavilion with her very interesting landscape paintings and other paintings, quotes those very texts in the context of an old painting, a 17th century painting, where you start to see that today you would say, well, how could Kandinsky say this? And yet his art is, of course, what still speaks to us. And so there's a lot of complexity in how politics are also in the eye of the beholder and the people who today have to live with it. And that's a very interesting problem I think we can talk about.
That is, yeah, absolutely. So, by the way, I'm going to go down the line and speak to Wim and Sandra and then open it up. So I'm not just going to wait until 10 minutes or 5 minutes before the end. I would love to hear from you. So please prepare your questions and please don't be shy. Wim Pijbes, you were the director of the Rijksmuseum, that magnificent institution, for many, many years in Amsterdam. And now you're running the philanthropic foundation. I'm going to try and pronounce it right. I didn't check with you before. Droom and Daad.
Excellent. Dream and do.
Sorry?
Dream and do.
Dream and do. That's what it means. Dream and do.
Farah e sogno.
Sorry?
In Italian. Dream and do.
Okay. And that's a fantastic credo to have as the name of your foundation. But, I mean, it's not just a foundation. You're about to open a whole host of new institutions and museums in Rotterdam, including a museum of migration, a number of other important cultural spaces. And so your view, you said to me in a little exchange earlier, is that there's more change going on outside the museum walls nowadays than inside. And you said there was a time when the director of the Tate, who we all know, then the director of MoMA, who we all know, they were kind of setting the agenda. And nowadays you're saying the change is happening outside, that the role of the museum is not to be a newspaper chasing, current events, but like an encyclopedia, like a compendium. And you did refer to Black Lives Matter and some of these movements as having an important role. So can you explain what your thinking is there?
Yeah, I was a bit challenging by saying that a museum is not a newspaper.
Your voice is not super loud.
So?
Yeah, bring it
Can
closer.
Is that better like this? Or? Okay. Well, a bit challenging. I argued that a museum is not a newspaper. So, yes, what's going on in society is reflected in a museum, however, not on a daily basis. So, if you talk about Black Lives Matter, yeah, Black Lives Matter is a movement, if I may put it that way, that is also resonating in museums nowadays, but I'm sure, because that movement is really big and really powerful that also will resonate in museums over 50 years. However, the incident or the murder on George Floyd, that specific event, so to say, is of course in newspapers and televisions, but not per se in a museum, because museums have a kind of distance between the daily events that take place all over the globe, everywhere, good or bad, war, anything that happens. And of course newspapers and social media and all these staccato things respond immediately 24/7 all around. A museum is not responding 24/7 on anything that happens in the world. Well, at least to my opinion. Museums should curate specific events and select artists or artworks that respond on these events that are worth collecting, of course, and as Mariët said, because we collect and we are active and open today for a present-day audience, but also for future generations. So museums are fantastic institutions, already existing for, let's say, 200-300 years, readying businesses for centuries. And they will be there, I hope, at least for centuries to come. So the challenge for museum people like us is to look very carefully what's going on in the world today and to pick and choose what is relevant, of course, for an audience that we have in the galleries today, but also for our collections, because these collections, they are the treasures of humanity today, but to give and to pass on for generations to come.
Okay,
so today and tomorrow, well, the conference is Art for Tomorrow, but museums are active today, but keeping always the future in mind.
Okay, but like how much time needs to lapse? Like for instance, if we have the murder of George Floyd, which is actually a planetary event. I mean, the whole planet, there was uprisings. There was just this movement that was global.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just a newspaper headline. How long do you think it takes for a museum to sort of actually represent the death of George Floyd in their? I mean, like how many years, or is there kind of like a time frame, or?
That depends on the events. I mean, we're working on the Museum of Migration now. So we have these cartons that were taken in the protests and thrown away afterwards. I picked them up, and they are now in the collection. So these handwritten signs, so to say, and maybe they will. These will be shown in exhibitions to come, and they're very, to me, valuable, because these are signs of the time. So museums do collect signs of the time. However, not everything is a sign of the time. I mean, it's difficult for me to judge. I mean, final judgment is not by contemporaries, but by future generations. So and that's difficult to do. So we collect what is we think, with the present state of mind, what is relevant. And we do that for today, but also for tomorrow. Yeah,
you have a tough job, I mean, I have to say. For me, it's just easier. You know, the news happens, I cover it. End of story.
That's also a tough job. But there's every day there's news. So a newspaper is, I mean, you just have to follow it and write it down. And every day there is a newspaper, right? It's your business. But not every day there is an acquisition for our museum. I mean, we follow. In that sense, in a kind of...
You have to digest everything.
Yeah, we have to digest it. I mean, that's the good word. And to evaluate. So we are a kind of filter.
Mariët, did you have something before I went?
Well, I was just wondering, our jobs are not easy as museum directors. I'm sure that's true for most jobs leading institutions. But hey, I was leading a university for quite some time. And I invite anybody to try that for a little while. It's great. You have the young people in front of you all the time.
Yeah, they keep you on your toes.
Yes, absolutely.
So Sandra Jackson-Dumont, you are the director of the Lucas Museum in LA, founded by George Lucas. I guess all of you have heard of George Lucas. And your museum is the first, you write on your website, to focus on storytelling through images. Your collections, they include such a wide range of items as the paintings of Norman Rockwell, objects from Star Wars, and contemporary artworks by Kara Walker. So you say that your responsibility is to serve everybody. But you also acknowledge that everybody's different. So that makes your job kind of a little bit difficult. And that you say also that you can't just serve an imaginary average visitor, because what is an average visitor? So can you describe to me how you square that circle?
Thank you all for having me today. And I should expand that a little bit, because it's Norman Rockwell to Star Wars to Kara Walker. That's a very small space of time. And so if we were to think even Artemisia Gentileschi or cave paintings, narrative art is stretched across time and place. And so we're a museum of visual storytelling. We're a museum dedicated to the art that has shaped society. It's acted on us, sometimes not always in our favor. Sometimes it's acted against us, but sometimes it's actually been propaganda in very much the ways that you're talking about it today. So how do we square that circle that we can be a museum for everyone? I think museums have the responsibility to think about relevance, and the real creative act is to lift that burden, to really think about the ways in which we want to tether works of art to issues in society, the places they were made, the people that shaped them. And so we square that circle by talking to people, by doing research, by behaving both the way museums have historically behaved, but also stretching the boundaries of that, looking at what we can learn from people that are developing great products. You know, Apple hasn't become like a worldwide seller of great things because they actually have just sat in a corner and decided they're going to keep doing it the same way they've done it. The great teachers of the world haven't actually maintained their relevance because they actually don't listen to what students are talking about on the yard. They actually are there, not necessarily always when they have the microphone. And so we see ourselves as students of the world, just like artists have reflected society. We see ourselves in very much the same way that, my two colleagues have shared, but we also see ourselves as being in the uncomfortable interstitial spaces that are not about just being purveyors of information, but about being kind of recipients of discourse.
So what are some of those uncomfortable interstitial spaces?
You just brought up a whole bunch of them. Politics, right? And so the very act of building a museum is a political act. But are we conflating politics with being partisan? Are we conflating politics with having a point of view? Every institution I've ever worked at has a point of view. It hasn't always aligned with mine. It hasn't always aligned with the public's either. It also hasn't aligned with history. And so are we conflating being political and having a point of view and caring about what's happening in the world with actually being partisan? That's a different thing. In the U.S., we cannot be a museum and be partisan. We actually don't have the privilege of that. But we see ourselves as places where we actually can be the place where discourse happens, where the dialogue about these issues kind of surfaces. And I think museums are safer places to do that than some of the other places in the world. Some other places are extremely dangerous to have that kind of discourse. If we can elevate museums as locations for that kind of dialogue, I think we actually have a major future in mind. But if we stay rooted in just being the purveyors of information, I think we're going to die.
Yeah, it does seem that there are more easier environments to do that kind of thing than universities, for sure. I mean, just reading the news. But, I would like to open this up. This says we have 4 minutes. That's right. Okay. So I was hoping Achilles would give me 10 more, but he just said no. So we do have 4 minutes for questions. That could be, enough time to answer some of the questions that might have arisen in the room. You have 3 incredible museum chiefs here. Yes, we have a question, and if you could introduce yourself, please, with your name and where you work. Please go ahead. Do you want to just
Speak
stand up
loudly.
and tell us your question?
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah Miko, architect from Paris. So I have a question for Mariët Westermann. You said that for you, museums should collect and display art of today. We all notice that Guggenheim museums are temples of architecture with a very iconic expression. So my question is, for you, what kind of relationship should contemporary architecture maintain with art?
Thank you very much for that beautiful question. I feel very blessed because the Guggenheim constellation of museums is indeed, one of its characteristics is that each of our museums is in a very specific, distinctive work of architecture. 3 of them contemporary buildings, 3 Franks. Frank Lloyd Wright and 2 times Frank Gehry in Bilbao and soon in Abu Dhabi, more than half built. And here the Peggy Guggenheim collection is not in a contemporary space, of course, in the little palazzo, 18th century unfinished palazzo that Peggy Guggenheim finished in a completely different way by working on the gardens and inhabiting it with what was for her the art of today, especially surrealism, but many other paintings. I think that at the Guggenheim, and this may be different from different museums, but we have a responsibility to architecture as one of the great original human art forms. I don't make the distinction, and here in Venice you can see why. We're part of our urban fabrics in these 4 different cities, and in each of our museums, I think the building is probably object number 1 in some ways to take care of and to steward. So thank you very much for that question. It's extremely important.
We have time for one more question, definitely. Yes, ma'am. Please introduce yourself. The microphones don't work.
Just stand up and shout.
Hello? Okay. Katarina Anesti, I'm the senior editor of Blue, the in-flight magazine of Aegean Airlines. I would like to ask each one of you, which is the greatest urgency that you have to deal with right now, okay, in the next 5 years?
Well, that's a question and a half.
Well, can you repeat the question?
Let's let the others start.
Let's start with Sandra.
Can you repeat the question?
What is the greatest urgency you have to deal with in the next, say, 5 years? Yeah, it's a tough one.
I think there's more than one concurrent urgency. You know, in Los Angeles, we are a city that has extreme houseless and homelessness. So what is the relationship between a museum and houseless and homelessness? Does it feel appropriate to just display images of that? Or is it more appropriate to be in dialogue as an institution, as an organization with some of these issues? I think another serious matter is how to help people understand and help museums understand the true relationship between what matters in people's everyday lives and what's happening in the museum. In Los Angeles, we have something called shade equity, which is that people die of heat stroke in the particular neighborhood in which we are living in greater capacity because there's not enough tree canopy covers. Our solution to that, and not a solution, but a kind of contribution to addressing that, is that we not only participate in that discourse, but our building, the architecture of our building, actually creates greater shade in this area, almost like tree canopy covers. And it was the intention of Ma to look at that, our architect. We share this architect. A third one will be about jobs, but by building this institution, we're creating jobs. All of these interventions and these relationships are about tethering to what's happening in people's true everyday life experiences as a museum, as an institution, and creating these opportunities that go together with looking and experiencing works of art. And all the things I'm talking about are on display on the walls in our institution as well. I think we often talk about the artwork and objects without talking about the people that go with them. And so I think the relevance today, and one of our greatest issues, is to figure out how we can talk about those in tandem.
That's a fantastic answer. We got two more.
I mean, the greatest urgency is that a museum should not become a newspaper. And I mean by that we have to stay focused on the main purpose of a museum. And what is a museum? It's a place to connect art, people, and culture. And museums are the threshold, so to say, the places where the best things of humankind, objects, but also ideas, are fostered. Fostered for today, fostered for generations to come. And that is increasingly more important with AI and everything that's going on in the world. Museums are places where authenticity is key, and authenticity really has the ability to give people the sense of humanity, of being human. And I think that is what museums are for.
Fantastic. You keep saying museums aren't newspapers. What's wrong with newspapers?
I was telling you.
Mariët.
As you've heard from the panel, we are all, as museum leaders, concerned that the urgent is kept in view, but not mistaken entirely for the important. The important and the urgent work on somewhat different and overlapping timescales. And so for me and for my Guggenheim colleagues, the most urgent is in fact also the most important of the next couple of years, which is to finish and open the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and bring this magnificent museum, again designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, fully into our constellation as its newest bright shining star, and use the opportunity not to say here's an individual thing, just like one of the other three, but to work on what we always are working on with the people are important, making sure that that museum, like the other three, is both part of one Guggenheim set of values grounded in the art of today and how we preserve and display it and work with it, let all these issues come forward as they can from the communities where they are. So one set of values, but really locally distinctive. That's the power of the constellation, and making sure that we welcome the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi into that wonderful ecosystem is my highest priority.
Farah, can I say, I'm sorry,
Sure,
can I say
Sandra.
one last thing? I think one of the other really pressing issues that I think tethers all of us together is that in a society where people are increasingly told what to think, how to think, fed ways of being, I think museums are the spaces where people can have the space to think for themselves.
That's a timely way to conclude. I think.
Well said.
Thank you so much to my shimmering panelists, and it's been wonderful being up here with you. I will be staying with you for the next talk.
Thank you, Farah. That was great.
I've never been called
Thanks a lot.
shimmering.